All right, this is a short lecture on the Federalist Era in the United States history. So this is the era directly after the adoption of the Constitution and up through the election of 1800. Basically, it covers the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams. There were a number of problems facing the young country at this point. The British had effectively closed their ports to American vessels. This was problematic because a lot of merchants had done the majority of their business both with ports in Great Britain itself and with ports throughout the British possessions, which remember includes much of Canada as well as many critical islands in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. The British also kept soldiers in forts out west that they were supposed to have surrendered. And many colonists believed that these British soldiers were providing support for Native Americans in their efforts to stop settlers from moving west. That's going to be one of the contributing factors later on in the War of 1812. Past this, Spain is still in control of the Mississippi, a river that many believe is crucial to the development of the United States. And of course, all the states, formerly colonies, are in their eyeballs up to debt as a result of the Revolutionary War. Now, as we go through this section, we want to continuously ask ourselves, what's the point? Because remember, as we go through this section, I'm going to give you some names, I'm going to give you some general dates, but we want to think broadly. What are the broad implications of all of these things? All right? So as I mentioned before, there were a number of issues that keep cropping up. And how the federal government is going to solve these problems in many ways shapes the America that we have today. So one of the most important reasons that we care about the Federalist Era is that it set a series of precedents. Those precedents are very important. So precedent is something that is established that a culture or society then follows as sort of a rule. The first precedent that is set are all set by George Washington. George Washington is the first president of the United States, runs unopposed in 2 terms, wins all the electoral votes that you can win. Now, the focus of the early constitutional government sort of revolves around George Washington and his personality, whether or not he's the one who's actually making those actions in each given case. Without George Washington, our government today would be markedly different. While historians do like to get away from the great man theory of history, and I also feel that that's the appropriate thing to do, that being said, we cannot ignore the immense influence of George Washington on our early government, which persists today. Every single thing that Washington did as president set a precedent. Every single thing that he did, I'll say it again, as president, set a precedent. He was, above all else, a man of extremely strong character who would give up the presidency after 2 terms, establishing a precedent that would not be broken until FDR in the mid-20th century. He believed in a strong, centralized government and had witnessed the chaos of the Articles of Confederation. One of the most important things that George Washington did to establish a precedent was to build the first ever executive cabinet. Presidents ever since have had cabinets made up of the different heads of the different executive offices. For example, you had Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. You had Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson. And you had a Vice President, John Adams. All of these men, to a large extent, believe in the federal system of government, that there's going to be a strong, centralized way that the country is going to be run. Now, many of the initial decisions that are facing the government are about the economy. The key person here is Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton felt that the United States needed to become a great country, and to do so, he felt that meant to develop industry and trading. And for this, he believed that America needed a banking industry, which they didn't have. The biggest problem facing American investors was that American credit was essentially shot after the Revolutionary War because many states had not repaid their debts. Hamilton's plan was for the national government to assume this state debt. Now, there were some objections to this. Some states had already paid their debt. Some had less to begin with. And most people, of course, at this point in history still thought very locally. They didn't think of themselves as members of the United States of America. They thought of themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers or from South Carolina. But Hamilton believed that America needed industry, and industry needs capital investment. The plan was not for the United States government to assume the debt and immediately pay it off. The plan was for the government to assume the debt and then issue bonds to help repay it, which would pay interest. This interest would go to wealthy people who would then get wealthier and, in Hamilton's mind, reinvest that income in the development of industry. He also believed that if the federal government assumed state debt, that it might also shift individual people's loyalties away from their states and to the federal government. Now, the other thing that Hamilton wanted to do was create a national bank. He believed a national bank would be key to developing industry because a national bank could make loans. And if a national bank could make loans, then the government could invest directly in the development of industry. The national bank would also be able to issue paper currency. Paper currency is obviously a lot easier to transport. It's a lot easier to use than hard specie, which is like coins. People believed back then you needed gold and silver coins with actual gold and silver in them. Hamilton wanted to move people away from that belief and instead towards the idea that there needed to be paper currency. Hamilton also, this one didn't take off as much, but he did propose a series of bonuses that the government could issue to people who develop new technologies and new patents. Congress ultimately did agree to accept the national bank and established it, and it did agree to assume state debt. These two actions instantaneously put the United States on a firmer footing. But Hamilton's plan didn't work for everyone. Hamilton wanted to raise money, and the way that he wanted to raise money was by export taxes and what are called excise taxes. Excise taxes are taxes on things that are seen as luxury good, and one of them was whiskey. Alexander Hamilton really wanted to tax whiskey. Now, the problem is for a lot of farmers in Western Pennsylvania at the time, who were a long way away from major metropolitan centers like Philadelphia and Baltimore and New York, it was very cumbersome for them to transport huge wagon loads of rye and sell that as a raw material. It was much easier to take that, distill it down into whiskey, send a few barrels down to Philadelphia, and make more money. Alexander Hamilton, by taxing this whiskey, was going after what these folks saw as their livelihood. In fact, the Pennsylvania legislature denounced the tax and thought it was anti-American. But Hamilton and Washington pushed forward. They believed that this was the opportunity for the federal government to put its stamp on its authority. After all, a government doesn't have legitimacy if no one listens to it. Washington, in fact, went forward and issued a proclamation for them to obey the law of the Western Pennsylvania farmers. They didn't. But by 1794, even George Washington's patience was exhausted. He put together a force of 12,000 men, more than enough, to put down what's called the Whiskey Rebellion. And the force was able to put down the rebellion without any bloodshed. This, and here's the main takeaway, what's the point? Why do we care? Because it proved for the first time that the government of the United States would be able to enforce their will. Now, as an aside, a lot of these farmers at this time really didn't have cause for complaint because 75% of the federal budget in this year was spent on wars on the western border against varying Indian nations trying to protect those same farmers. In 1790 to 1791, Indians along the Ohio River Valley made aggressive efforts to push back against settlements. However, in August of 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the United States Army scored a massive victory, opening up the region for expansion. Now, while all this was going on at home, there were also big foreign concerns. The United States was still surrounded by colonial powers, England, France, and Spain, who had major issues there and major issues back in Europe. First and foremost was the French Revolution, which began in 1789. Initially, everyone in the United States supported the French Revolution, or at least everyone who wrote anything down. However, as the revolution went on, what began as a very peaceful transfer of power turned into what historians call the Reign of Terror, or in short, just the Terror. As you can guess, the Terror was not a bunch of Frenchmen peacefully sitting around and talking. As the French Revolution became more and more radical, the United States split into two groups, one that was decidedly pro France and one that was decidedly pro England. Moreover, the French Revolution triggered decades of war in Europe, lasting from roughly 1792 to 1815, and American attitudes were very much divided about what they should do. Another problem with the United States during this time is that it tried to declare its neutrality in wars, especially between France and Great Britain. But what neutrality meant in every case was very difficult to determine. For example, America had neutral harbors. Did that mean that both British and French ships would be allowed to use them? Could they use them at the same time? And what were the implications of a British naval blockade of American ports that prevented the French from doing so? Worse still, the British adopted a policy that is known as impressment. Impressment was the idea that, at least initially, British soldiers or sailors who were on merchant vessels could be impressed or forced to serve in the British Navy. Impressment was exercised throughout the British Isles. Young men were often just abducted and thrown into the British Navy effectively, even if they didn't want to be. The problem for America was every time a British warship stopped an American merchant vessel, especially depending upon what the foreign policy of the United States was at that time, they had a tendency to just impress into service everybody there who couldn't prove their identity. Of course, this is pre-driver's licenses and things of that nature. So any American who couldn't prove that they were American were assumed to be British and were forced to join the British Navy. This massively aggravated the people in the United States. Now, Washington, during his two terms, decided that he would stay completely neutral between the two competing sides, and that worked well as long as he was the president. The problem is, he wasn't always the president. And the other thing that's really important about the Federalist era is the development of the two-party system. America, by and large, throughout its history, has been a two-party system, which means there's two political parties that people choose from in different voting scenarios. After Washington left office, these two parties developed for the first time. Their roots are essentially between two different ways of seeing the United States, but they break down in a couple of party lines. There's the Federalists, who were led by people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. And then there was the other party, whose lengthy name, Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, is often just shortened to Republicans. That being said, the modern Democratic and Republican Party bear no relation to this initial party, so you shouldn't read into the name in any way, shape, or form. These two men were very different. First of all, in terms of who they thought should rule. Jefferson tended to believe that the future of America was in small, independent farms, and that those farmers should be trusted to make their own decisions. Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and to a large extent George Washington were very much what we today would call elitist. They believed that most Americans didn't have the sophistication necessary to answer the big political questions of the day. And once people had elected a government, they really shouldn't go around criticizing it because they weren't smart enough to do so anyway. Moreover, there was the ongoing war in Europe, whereas the Federalists tended to be pro-Britain, also called Anglophile. The Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans wanted the United States to honor their ongoing treaty with the French. They were called Francophiles. There's also a difference between the two parties in terms of strong and weak government. Jefferson favored stronger state governments and a weaker federal government, whereas the Federalists favored a strong centralized authority. That being said, these two groups at this point are absolutely not what we would call modern political parties. They didn't have official platforms, they didn't have conventions, they didn't have different organizations that you could join to support them. This is how we group people who tended to think and vote the same way. The election of 1796 was the first real election in United States history, and during which John Adams, who's the last Federalist president, prevails over Thomas Jefferson. The Adams administration continued to deal with neutrality violations by both France and England. Adams sought to maintain a neutral policy almost no matter what. American envoys in Paris who tried to negotiate with the French, however, were forced to pay a massive bribe. When this information got back, it enraged the citizens of the United States of America, and it seemed like war was imminent. Congress, in fact, agreed to pay for a fleet to fight the French. Washington agreed to come out of retirement for the same purpose. But at the last moment, the French changed tactics. France wanted to develop the Louisiana Territory and realized it could not do so with a belligerent United States on its back, and so it became much more complacent. While the neutrality of the Adams administration was politically costly to the Federalists, universally, historians today believe it was the right decision. The United States was simply too fragile for it to take on another major foe. However, that wasn't the only important thing of the Adams administration. It's also known for the infamous Alien and Sedition Act. In their hearts, most Federalists believed that they were 100% right in how they saw the government of the United States. And anybody who didn't see the government their way were trying to take it over and twist it into something that it was not. They saw anybody who opposed them not as a different political party, but as dangerous insurrectionists. The Alien and Sedition Act tried to curb this, at least from their mind. The Alien Act allowed the government to deport dangerous aliens. So those are foreign peoples residing in the United States. No one was deported under this act, so it's never really cited. The bulk of the criticism came on the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act allowed the government to prosecute anyone who criticized or spoke against the government, unless they could prove that what they said was true. And that's important. Most times in the legal system, if you are the defendant, you don't have to prove anything. The prosecution has to prove their side. What this act did was shift the burden of proof. So now defendants had to prove that they were innocent. One of the most famous cases was actually a member of Congress, Matthew Lyon, who went to jail for criticizing the Adams administration. Overall, these two acts proved to be very unpopular, both with Federalists and Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. But they caused Jefferson and Madison to pen what are called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. The idea behind the Virginia and Kentucky Resolution is that it gets to the heart of what's in the Constitution. The idea was that any powers not delegated to the federal government were regulated to the states. What that meant is any time the federal government overreached itself, that the states could nullify it. The states could effectively say, we aren't going to support or enforce this law, so it doesn't exist within our boundaries. This is an important concept that's going to come up all the way through, including the Civil War, and then crop up again when we get to civil rights and the civil rights movement. The idea of nullification and the idea of a federal supreme power are two competing interests that are going to continue to be stress points throughout early American history. Now, technically, who gets to review federal cases in terms of whether or not they jibe with the Constitution? will be a question that is going to be settled by John Marshall and the Supreme Court. However, today in this discussion, I will not be talking about the Supreme Court because that's a much lengthier and separate topic. The election of 1800 essentially brought the Federalist era to an end. It was a brutal, brutal election campaign between two men who were both founding fathers and friends, but turned against each other. Jefferson was accused of being an atheist and someone who would immediately throw the United States into war on the side of the French. Adams was thought of as a lackey of the British and someone who wanted to set up his own monarchy. In the end, Thomas Jefferson prevailed after some interesting funny business that I'll get into in another discussion, and the Federalists were shocked by their defeat. And it proved to be the end of Federalist political power, though, as I said, not necessarily in the courts. So, what are the main takeaways of the Federalist era? So, first of all, the Federalist era establishes many of the precedents that we still follow today. Things like the two-party system, 2 terms for the president, which is, of course, an amendment now. Things like the presidential cabinet, and things like the federal government having the ultimate say over many, if not most, of the issues in the United States. Crucially, the other key takeaway is economic stability. Hamilton's plan provided the United States with desperately needed credit at a time when there simply wasn't any in the United States. Without his intervention, it's extremely unlikely that the later industrial and economic growth of the United States would have been possible.